Hi everyone, today we welcome back Tom Peaple to talk about the Odyssey, and content warning, there will be discussion of rape and infidelity during the interview because of the contents of the poem. So we welcome Tom back to the studio. Thank you for coming back on the programme. So, do you need to have read the Iliad to understand the events in the Odyssey?
I think that's a bit like saying, do you have to have watched Cheers to enjoy Frasier? Although I admit I've never watched Cheers, so I'm having to guess a little here for the comparison. But what I mean is both involve a sort of side character, not insignificant character by any means, but not the main character, from one book becoming the centre stage of another, and other people from the original sort of making cameo appearances, as it were. Long cameos, but nonetheless, you briefly see Helen, you briefly see the spirit, because of course he's dead by now, of Achilles. You briefly see Menelaus. You briefly see Agamemnon again as a spirit, because he's been killed, murdered in between the events. So I would say, while there's nothing wrong with, and it might make it even more interesting to read the Odyssey knowing the Iliad, I don't think it's essential by any means.
Why does Odysseus take 10 years to return from Troy?
Well, the basic idea is, after he leaves Troy, him and his men, among other adventures, end up at the home of a Cyclops, who I think it's pronounced Polyphemus. If I'm wrong, people please correct me. But the point is, it has been probably one of the most famous scenes of the Odyssey. Odysseus tells him that his name is No Man, so when they try to escape, they attack Polyphemus, and when he's asked by the other Cyclopses what happened, he says, "No man has hurt me." So they say, "Ah, well, you're probably just sick then, don't worry." And then No Man escapes, because why does he need any help if No Man has escaped? Then Odysseus, in a rather silly move, decides to call out, once they're out of shot, or out of range, "Hey, Polyphemus, I'm Odysseus, and I beat you." The problem is that Polyphemus has a rather powerful father, namely the deity Poseidon. So basically, he then causes all kinds of things to go wrong to Odysseus, culminating in Odysseus being basically held captive on an island by Calypso, who I think is some kind of deity, but perhaps a lesser deity. It's not always clear in the mythology, but that's the basic idea, and she holds him there for 7 of those 10 years, until basically one day Poseidon has been sent to, or has gone to Ethiopia, because they're having a big festival in his name. And Zeus basically says to Athena, whilst Poseidon's distracted and can't stop you, rescue Odysseus. Basically take the opportunity while he's gone. So, a big part of it is the 7 years he's been held by Calypso and the anger of Poseidon for blinding his son. Now, the fact that he did so in retaliation for the said son eating some of Odysseus' crew cuts no ice with Poseidon. Greek deities are very good at not being very fair.
How come Odysseus is the only hero of the Iliad to get a happy ending?
Well, that's debatable. I mean, certainly Agamemnon doesn't get a happy ending. He gets home and is immediately murdered for various reasons, which I think we touched on in another video, but if not, we could happily go back there another time. But yeah, he gets murdered. Achilles dies in the war. And very crucially in the Odyssey, you find out their afterlife isn't very pleasant. Achilles even tells Odysseus it's better to be the lowest, I forget the exact phrase, but something like be the lowliest servant alive than to be king of the dead. So it is not a very pleasant ending for any of them. However, Menelaus does get home, and I've looked into it, but I can't find much evidence of what happens afterwards. So he may well have lived out a life with Helen and died of old age. Odysseus also may or may not have exactly a happy ending, because what's often forgotten, and is, I haven't seen the new version, but I know I used to have this version of the Odyssey on video. For point of reference, it was the one with Isabella Rossellini, and that one seemed to end with Odysseus and Penelope reunited like it's a complete happy ending. But in the poem, Odysseus then explains that he has to go, basically the next day he has to set off on another quest. So he gets like one night home with Penelope and then has to go again. And apparently he won't be able to stop until he reaches a place so far inland that when he mentions boats, the people have never heard of them. So whether he gets a happy ending is itself somewhat ambiguous.
As Christopher Nolan is bringing out a film adaptation of the Odyssey, are there any aspects of the Odyssey that you believe would struggle to be adapted for film?
Well, I know there's a question coming up about morality and modern values. So for this question I'm going to focus on the practicalities of filming. And one of the biggest ones I think will be interesting to see how they tackle this on film is the fact that the main character doesn't appear at the beginning. What I mean by that is, if you read the Odyssey, the first few books involve Odysseus' son Telemachus. Again, I might be pronouncing that wrong, I've only really seen it written down. I think it might be Telemachus. But basically it starts with Athena finding him and him going on various quests where he learns more about his father. So it's about 4 books before Odysseus actually appears. A very unusually long time. I mean, to give you a comparison, the book Anne of Green Gables doesn't have Anne appear till chapter 2, and yet virtually every adaptation adds a pre-credits scene, as it were, so that Anne appears right at the beginning, and that's 1 chapter wait. In Odysseus, in the Odyssey, you have to wait for Odysseus till part 4, so it'll be interesting whether they'll stick to that, or whether they want to change it so that the first shot we get is of Odysseus.
Would you say there are aspects of the Odyssey which might be less palatable for a 21st century audience? Oh, and by the way, audience, there might be issues with this bit, so you might want to skip to the timestamp of the next question.
Yeah. I'll give the specific trigger warnings: sexual abuse and infidelity. So, first one is the absolute hypocrisy of men and women in terms of fidelity. While Penelope is praised as the loyal wife who didn't sleep with a single man despite having various suitors, Odysseus actually spends a whole year having a sexual relationship with a woman called Circe, or rather a witch. Now, okay, you could say that he went in there in the first place to rescue his comrades who'd been turned into pigs. So perhaps the first night he slept with Circe could be argued as in some way forced, but the rest of that year, the poem doesn't really give him that excuse. It's more like, after sorting all that out, he could have just gone, but decides to spend a whole year cheating on his wife with Circe without real justification. So that doesn't look so good, particularly as Odysseus is supposed to be the hero. So, oh yeah, he cheats on his wife for a year while she faithfully waits at home. And then we have the far more scary bits, which is the hanging of the maids. Basically, at one point 12 maids are hanged for having sex with the various suitors. So all the people who've been trying to marry Penelope have been hanging around, and apparently they've had sex with some of the maids. So 12 maids are hanged for having sexual intercourse with the suitors. Except that at one point when Odysseus is shouting at the suitors, he says, I can't remember all the things he says, but he basically says, you've stolen my food, you've abused my wife's hospitality, and you've raped my servants. So he's actually saying that the maids were raped, even though they've been punished for it. Now, some do try to say, oh, in fact, I've heard someone say to me, oh, well, it's probably just Odysseus exaggerating, he's just throwing every accusation he can at them. And others have said, oh, well, maybe it's just a continuity error because these things were originally transmitted orally, as far as we can tell. Maybe some bits got lost or confused. Now, another explanation that has been discussed is that the 12 who were hanged chose to sleep with the suitors and it's other maids who were raped. But I still find this one not a very satisfactory explanation, because the logic of that would still mean, because you've got to remember, it's hard enough as a servant, when someone's a servant today, it's hard to say no to the clients because they are seen to have an element of power. And in those societies where it was even more the case, because there was such a big thing about hospitality, and servants were treated even worse than they may be today. And when you add the fact that by all accounts they spend most of the time drunk, so I just find it hard to sort of say, yes, well, when this incredibly drunk man who had power over this woman because he was a guest and she was a servant came up to her and demanded intercourse, she deserves to be punished because she said yes. I found that a lot more disturbing than some would like to think. So I think even with that explanation, it looks rather raw and rather problematic that Odysseus had them hanged for doing it. So that's a very dark and rather concerning aspect of Odysseus for a modern reader. And I hope I'm okay with plugging another work in this channel, but this is not for any sponsorship reason or anything, it's just a book I've read. A very interesting discussion of this happens in the novel The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, which is well worth looking into. But yeah, so both his infidelity and the possibility that he executes, but nonetheless kills a group of women essentially for being raped, are rather problematic when one puts a 21st century eye to it.
Welcome back for those who needed to skip over that part. Is there anything you're hoping for from Christopher Nolan's upcoming film of the Odyssey?
I don't want to exactly say hoping for, because I think it's really going to be how he chooses to interpret a legend which, in fairness, is not set in stone. I mean, there are various other versions of the events of the Odyssey, some even from classical times, such as Euripides' play The Cyclops, which takes the Polyphemus incident in a much more humorous way. Odysseus appears differently in some other Greek plays at the time, so I think I would love to see how he will handle the aspects I mentioned above, and how he will handle the various supernatural elements in an age where far fewer people seem to believe in deities at all, and even fewer believe in the Greek ones who are so essential to the Odyssey. So we'll see how it goes. Or I will. Some people have already seen how it goes, but I wanted to make this video fresh before watching the film, so I'll see.
Thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you found it interesting and informative. And we look forward to seeing you again. And it was lovely having you here.